Hey class, how you doing? Wanted to talk a little bit today about chapters 4 and 5 and just get us started with some of the note taking. Hopefully you're taking notes on your reading. Chapters 1 through 3 are really, really good chapters in that they kind of get us started talking about things like the takers and the leavers, the protagonist, the main character who doesn't have a name, Ishmael, who's talking to him, who's this big gorilla. What is Ishmael talking about? He's talking about these feelings that Mr. P has about knowing something is going on in the world that is wrong and that he wants to make a change, but he doesn't really know how. He doesn't even really know what the problem is. Okay, so we're all going to be talking about this, and we are all talking about this because you guys are watching The Matrix right now, and the main character Neo also feels this feeling as well. Something's not quite right with the world. We find out in The Matrix that really it's because robots have taken control of our minds and are feeding us this fake alternate reality while simultaneously collecting the energy from us. And we've pretty much lost, the human race is lost and the robots have won. So that's the sci-fi story, but this story is Ishmael's a little bit more complex and a little bit more about us in a little bit more of a real sense. It's not a science fiction story like The Matrix is. However, I think there are some really great parallels that can be drawn from the two things, and that's what I'm asking you guys about this week. Is ignorance bliss? How do we know that we're being lied to? What are the ways that we can kind of get ourselves out of a situation that's bad for us? And one of the things that I've talked about with others, with students and everything, is that we have to develop critical thinking skills and start to ask questions. And that's all sounds great, but the problem is asking questions can lead to all sorts of difficult things. Asking the right kinds of questions can be extremely dangerous in our society, and it can cause rifts between us and people we care about and love, or other people. And it can also make us undesirable people to hang out with. So that helps us, that's a part of the problem, right, with asking lots of questions. And that's the reason why a lot of people just have a tendency not to. There are other reasons as well. We have a tendency to remain ignorant and not ask questions. And so we want to talk about the ways in which we can start to identify what critical thinking is and start asking some really good questions, the right kinds of questions, questions that, and understand that those questions can be difficult. But I think that that's a part of it. So that's where we are. I'm gonna share screen here, talk a little bit about my note taking. So hopefully you can see it here. And these are some of the notes that I've been taking. So we start off with chapters 1 through 3 with some general ideas, the takers and the leavers. The takers being the dominant culture, the culture that kind of took off from the agricultural revolution. And we're going to learn all about that later in the book. We're already starting to see that later in later chapters. And the leavers, another group of people that are distinct from the takers, but have to live in the world that the takers have kind of created. And it's all about this kind of like control over the environment, control over the world, control over other humans, devaluing human life and devaluing natural life, setting ourselves apart from others and setting ourselves apart from the natural world. And that's kind of behind the taker's philosophy. That's what Ishmael has been talking about. He does talk about how the takers and the leavers both have this thing called mother culture. And mother culture is this idea or this concept that the story that we're telling ourselves is broadcast in a number of different ways by our friends, by our parents, by by religious people, by the media, television, advertising, music, and we're getting all of these messages from all sorts of different people and places, and we would call that mother culture because it's all part of this system that is talking to us. And some we listen to far more than others, like mother culture messages that are coming from the media, television, movies, music, advertising, social media, etc. So that's mother culture. And we've got this taker worldview as a result of the listening to mother culture and the story that we've been telling ourselves. And that is that control over the environment equals superiority. And superiority sets us apart from the natural world. And we get this through many of the stories that Ishmael is telling. And that's what Ishmael does. He tells a story, okay? He gives us different stories, different scenarios. We call those anecdotes. So through those anecdotes or allegories, stories, we get a little mini lesson, okay? And we get that from the jellyfish story, this story where there's this, anthropologist studying this life form, which is the jellyfish. And he asks him to tell him about his creation story. And the jellyfish goes through a story that's much like our own, something that we would think of as scientifically proven, right? So it has evolution in it, it has all of this stuff. But the end result for the jellyfish is this moment where he very proudly says, and then it ended, then the jellyfish arrived. And that perspective of being the end of creation, being the end of evolution, is what Ishmael is saying is what the takers are also doing or saying. So the jellyfish story is really a story about the taker's perspective. How did we get to be this way? Is one of the questions that Mr. P, the protagonist, the narrator, asks. How did we get to be this way, Ishmael? And Ishmael is going to give us this discussion. That's where we start off with the end of chapter 3, with the jellyfish story and the man being the climax of creation, the end all of creation, meaning everything is built up to mankind being here. That's a perspective. It's a perspective most people follow. And lots of people would argue that point extremely aggressively. And they would argue that point, and that's what Ishmael is trying to point out, is that they are trying to argue this point about us being superior and us being separate from all other creatures. Well, it's an argument. Ishmael saying, no, actually, he's going to argue the opposite, that we are a part of a living system and we are just one part of it. We're part of the natural world. And if we continue to see ourselves as separate, then that's creating problems. And that's creating problems for us. So, and how are we doing that? By perpetuating this story. Okay, so we get to chapters 4 and 5. And I'm going to erase 6 here because we don't get to 6 yet in this discussion. So chapters 4 and 5, where we're really talking about the ability to go past that perspective and to start to ask some interesting questions. How did we get to be this way? Okay, so we start off with that question. How did we get to be with this way? Let's finish the story, and that the jellyfish started. So if the jellyfish just arrived and became the jellyfish and creation stopped or evolution stopped, the same goes for the story for the takers. Man was the end of evolution and it all stopped. Well, what's the middle and what's the end of that story? And that's the big question. And Ishmael and Mr. P start to discuss the agricultural revolution and agricultural technology. And they really talk about, in that beginning of the 4th chapter, they really discuss how man becomes this agriculturalist, and that gives them control, right, over nature. It gives them control over their own destiny as well, because they're able to um, uh, save food, have food. They don't experience famine. They don't experience all those things. Although you might say, well, people go hungry in our world all the time. People are starving right now. Children are starving. Why is that the case? We will get to that. Ishmael gets to that. The idea or the concept of famine and starvation in a first world country or as a taker people is a really interesting question. We're not there yet. So, but he will start to answer that question later on in the book. What we want to know, though, is that agricultural technology gave way to control over nature. It gave way to us becoming separate from other animals, other species, and plants and animals for that, if we're going to go there. And that became a jumping off point for us, right? It gave us control over nature, gave us control over human food and consumption. And that he calls on page 69, a machine designed to produce human life support systems. Okay, and this quotation is particularly important because it describes what's going on, right? He says the limitations of the hunting-gathering life had kept man in check for 3 million years. With agriculture, those limitations vanished, and his rise was meteoric. Settlement gave rise to division of labor gave rise to technology, et cetera, et cetera. Down later, it says the takers, the world is a human life support system. Okay, according to the takers, the world is a human life support system, a machine designed to produce and sustain human life. Well, where do we go from there? Okay, and it doesn't seem like such a bad thing. And that's the question that starts to take over, right? This doesn't seem like a bad thing. This seems like a good thing for human beings, right? To control their destiny, right? But they're given a choice. And the takers, and Ishmael talks about this in the next part, he talks about a choice that the takers are getting, right? By fulfilling their destiny, they're getting a choice of how they're going to fulfill or finish or end their destiny. And he brings up this mythological character. So if you're into Greek myths, you'd be interested in this. But he talks about Achilles and how Achilles is given the choice of either a long, uneventful life in obscurity or dying young and having this brief life of incredible glory where he'll go to the afterworld or the underworld. This is thousands of years ago, obviously. So the underworld, concepts of the underworld were a little bit different. But the underworld, and he would be like a god in death, but he'd be a god of the underworld. And he would, but that he would be celebrated for his really brief life of glory. And the taker's choice is the choice of Achilles, okay? So that becomes particularly interesting, I think. Okay, so Achilles chooses a brief life of glory, and that becomes the taker's choice, a brief life of glory. Well, what's the alternative? The alternative is the lever's point of view, which is a long, uneventful life in obscurity. And you're going to watch a video by a famous archaeologist, someone who uncovers human remains and talks about talks a lot about where we were thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And Louise Leakey is one of those people. And so she talks about that in the video. And this is the idea or the concept of the levers, because she really says at one point that mankind or that humankind evolved with this idea that that they were separate. They were separate, and they really were for a really long. We have been separate as a species for a very long time. There aren't other species that are just like us walking around, like you might have with other species of upright walking apes, for example, or apes, for example. our closest relatives are the chimpanzee, the bonobo, the gorilla, right? So all of those things. So Louise talks about how they've been, upright walking apes, this other species that kind of were like us, right? Hominidic species were like us for more than hundreds of thousands of years, right? And we've only been around for about 200,000 years as a species. And she talks about how, for the most part, usually it's about 2 million years that this kind of a species that's similar to us was around. So we're going to be possibly a very short-lived species because we are enacting, in her argument, our own destruction. And that's what Ishmael is talking about as well. So she's saying, Louise Leakey says that other species that were like us were involved in living a long and uneventful life in obscurity. And human beings, the way that we see ourselves now, is really taking on after that Achilles, which is the brief life of glory. And that's our destiny. Okay, and we have chosen that destiny, and that becomes our story. Okay, so I'm going to erase that, and I'm going to say, not the story, right? If we're living the way that Achilles is talking about us, we're living our story. And what is our story, right? What are we following? Well, we're going along this brief life of glory. And what does that mean? It means we're enacting the story that casts man as the enemy of the world, because he's trying to control it, because he's trying to control his own environment and therefore controls the other environments. That's the beginning of the argument that Ishmael is going to make. So we haven't gotten that far yet, but we will make that. He will make that distinction. And he's also arguing that the story isn't working. Would you say that it's working? That's the question I want you to think about. Is it working for you? Do you think that humans are living this life as a society, as a species, not one individual person, but as a species? Are we living in a way that is going to make us continue on for a really long time? Or are we causing a lot of these things that are going to lead to an eventual destruction of our species in an untimely way, so sooner? And so that's the big question. That's the argument that Ishmael is making, right? Is that that we're making decisions for ourselves. We're making decisions for ourselves that go against our species. Okay, so in chapter 5, we really take off from there and we start to identify how things came to be this way. And we get to this page 84, and I'm going to read it out for you because I think it's probably the most important section. And when you read it, hopefully you made a note on it, and hopefully you'll go back to it if you didn't. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with people. Given a story to enact that puts them in accord with the world, let me stop sharing here. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with people. Given a story that enact that puts them in accord with the world, they will live in accord with the world. But given a story to enact that puts them at odds with the world, as yours does, they will live at odds with the world. Given a story to enact in which they are the lords of the world, they will act like the lords of the world. And given a story to enact in which the world is a foe to be conquered, they will conquer it like a foe. And one day, inevitably, their foe will lie bleeding to death at their feet, as the world is now. All right, so this is a particularly important quotation for us. Excuse me, pardon me. All right, this is a particularly important quotation for us. The way the world is seen is by the takers means that this is the story that they have been enacting, and the story that's all about how they're going to destroy themselves and destroy the area that they're living in. And that's, again, my question to you. Do you see this as being something that is occurring right now in our everyday current lives? in what ways does the Matrix also, the movie The Matrix, also kind of complement that discussion, right? Um, we become the ones that tore the sky in the Matrix. And that's a really important question. So with this, with what we're writing here, I put this under synthesis, which is basically just breaking all of these ideas down and really thinking about this. And I want us to gravitate towards this part as being the really important part. We are enacting a story that isn't working because it seemed like the right story. We're interested in control and power, right? Control and power over ourselves and over our environment. And that story isn't working for us. That's Ishmael's argument. Okay. And then we're going to watch, you guys are going to watch this short video about Louise Leakey and her father's quote, where she just basically says, he says, we do things that are bad for our species survival. And we are unique in that way. Not many other species or any other species actively make choices that are bad for the species survival. Now, this is an important thing in terms of English and the way we're thinking about English. But you want to think about mankind, M-A-N, mankind, as this larger species, not an individual person or man, okay? So the species of mankind is making decisions that are actively going against what's good for them. And that's what Louise Leakey's father really quotes. That's what I want you guys to think about this week. Is how does that quote go with Ishmael's discussion? This is a quotation that is years and years and years after the book Ishmael came out, and so and given by another scientist, somebody else who's looking at our history of our remains and making these distinctions and theories about what's happening to us. We also have the Matrix, right? With Morpheus, and we choose, and Morpheus saying we choose to destroy ourselves, and we choose to continue with a lie. And that's the big question of the Matrix. We're choosing, right? In the Matrix, humankind is choosing to continue with the lie of living in the Matrix. And these special people have to come and pull them out of that. And most of them, like Cypher, don't want to leave. Why? And that's the big question I'm asking you this week as well. Is it better to live the lie if it's comfortable? Well, most of us would say no, but I would also ask the question, could you honestly say that you would do the things that were necessary to change the world if it was uncomfortable or even dangerous or life-threatening to you and your family? What distinction or what would it take for you to do those things? And in the Matrix, it's dangerous. They could die, right? So that's a really important question, is what are we willing to do, right? What are we willing to do for this? Are we willing to die? How dangerous is it? And even if it doesn't cause death, it definitely causes um, being ostracized from society, being alienated from the people you care about or love if you ask questions, right? And there's another really interesting story called Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And Plato's Allegory of the Cave is all about this person who becomes freed and taken out of this alternate world that he realizes is not real. This is written 2,000 years ago or more. And the Allegory of the Cave is a story about how dangerous it is to go back into that cave as well and try and free other people. Why is that? Okay, so that's the big question, right? And we want to ask that question. Let me just erase some of this so I can write something down here. Okay. And that's the big question, is like, what would you be willing to do to live in truth? Oops. What would you do if you were Neo, if you were the person in the cave, if you were Mr. P in Ishmael? Okay, what would you do? Right? What is your life like? What are you willing to 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 do to have that truth, or to understand the world in a very true way? And how dangerous is it? And what's the result, right? What is the end result, right, of living this kind of world, in this kind of world? And what's the end result of asking questions, right? What are examples in our world where people ask those questions? What kinds of people are those? We might call them heroes. We also might call them something else, right? So I want you to think about that when you're watching The Matrix, when you're reading Ishmael, and when you watch this other video, and when we're culminating with the readings, right, is how did we get to be this way, right? If we are this enacting a story, right, that doesn't mean that we're just fundamentally flawed. It means something else, right? And that's what I want you to ask yourselves, because that's what's going to take you to the next part of the book, where he's going to start to not just ask the questions, but Ishmael's going to start with his argument, and his argument, how we got to be this way, and what's at stake, right? What will happen if we don't change some of the things that we're changing. So that's what I've got for you today. And I think it's a lot of really interesting stuff. Ishmael is definitely dense and sometimes a little complex or complicated. You have to go back and reread some parts, but that's a part of it. That's what makes it fun. Because a lot of this stuff, when you're reading it, you might go, oh, I've thought about this before, but it's nice to see other people talking about it. And that's what Ishmael does for us, is he asks a lot of really good questions. We might not agree with everything he says. I definitely don't, but I think it's really important to ask the questions. So that's where I'm going to leave you today. And I hope you really enjoyed the Matrix, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about it in those discussion boards. Okay, all right, bye-bye.